Heathens, welcome to Reality's Breakdown. Today we're going to be talking, is this just fantasy? Is the theme of our show. I am the belligerent atheist, so thank you for stopping by. Very excited about today. Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? That's kind of the theme, what we're doing. So today for clerics we have myself, the belligerent atheist, and Matt, the apoplectic atheist. And today we have a special guest. Before I introduce her, I'd like to remind everybody to stick around for the Atheist Spotlight near the end of the show. We're going to highlight just a YouTube channel that we like and why we think they're awesome. So today, our special guest is Dr. Kristi Winters. She has a PhD in political science. She was Senior Research Officer for the 2005 British Election Study, and she also conducted the 2010 Qualitative Election Study of Britain. She's also published several articles on politics, gender, and electoral behavior, and she also has her own YouTube channel and her own Twitter. We will put links in the description below, so please check out her content afterwards. She's got some really great stuff on there. Okay, so is this just a fantasy? So today we're covering a cognitive science paper, or the Cognitive Science Multidisciplinary Journal has an article by Corriveau, Chen, and Harris titled Judgments About Fact and Fiction by Children from Religious and Non-Religious Backgrounds. The information for this paper will be in the description below, as long as many of the resources that are involved in the actual writing of the paper to include studies and other information referenced. We'll be covering the information in the paper and also some of our own points of view, and I'm going to read the abstract and introduction since I doubt I could sum it up better myself, and we can discuss further from there. Before I read the abstract and introduction and then my question, I would like to have Dr. Winters kind of break it down in a little bit more of a layman perspective, just kind of make it easily digestible before I go into that. So, Dr. Winters?
Hello, hi. So in this article, it includes two studies that were done by the researchers, and they were asking a very narrow question, which is when children are exposed to either a religious background or a secular background, does this have an effect on their ability to distinguish real characters and fantasy characters in stories? And we can talk a little bit more about the two studies that they did, but what they found was when they talked to kids, I think 5 and 6 years old, just a small group of them, they separated them out between kids who had basically public school education and secular background and kids who had had religious education or exposure in their home or in their schools. And they showed them a real story, a story about a real person, a story about a slightly fantastical person, and then a story that's clearly fantasy. And what they found was that kids in both groups could identify the real person and the real story when presented, but after that the results diverged, and the secular kids were more likely to identify somebody in a fantastical story as not being real, whereas kids from a religious background were more likely to say that person might be real, and they would use God or other kind of miracles to justify why that could really happen. So what the authors are concluding is that how kids are the impact of being raised in a religion does have an ability to at least influence the way that kids at that age are able to distinguish between fantasy and reality. And then the question, of course, becomes, what happens when you use other groups, or what happens when they get older? How long does this effect last, and those kinds of things. So this is one data point that is also in line with other theories about how children understand fantasy and reality in the world. But of course, as atheists, this is something that I think we're very, very much interested in, because so much of adult faith rests on an ability to kind of fudge that line between fact and fantasy. So I think that kind of gives it some context, but if you want to read the abstract now, to let the researchers speak in their own very precise language.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Winters, for that. I appreciate you kind of summarizing it. Now I will read the abstract as printed in the article. In two studies, 5- and 6-year-old children were questioned about the status of the protagonist embedded in 3 different types of stories. In realistic stories that only included ordinary events, all children, irrespective of family background and schooling, claimed that the protagonist was a real person. In religious stories that included ordinarily impossible events brought about by divine intervention, claims about the status of the protagonist varied sharply with exposure to religion. Children who went to church or were enrolled in parochial school, or both, judged the protagonist in religious stories to be a real person, whereas secular children with no exposure to religion judged the protagonist in religious stories to be fictional. Children's upbringing was also related to their judgment about the protagonist in fantastical stories that included ordinarily impossible events, whether brought about by magic, study 1, or without reference to magic, study 2. Secular children were more likely than religious children to judge the protagonist in such fantastical stories to be fictional. The results suggested that exposure to religious ideas has a powerful impact on children's differentiation between reality and fiction, not just for religious stories, but also for fantastical stories. So in the introduction of the article, the very first section states, children often learn about people such as Cinderella, Tom Sawyer, George Washington, and Rosa Parks in the context of a narrative. However, these protagonists vary in their status. Cinderella and Tom Sawyer are fictional characters, whereas George Washington and Rosa Parks were real people. When children hear about protagonists, do they grasp that some are make-believe, whereas others are real? And before we go knee-deep into the study, I'd like to ask the two of you, don't children have an inclination for fairy tales at this age? And aren't fairy tales and fiction an important part of the development of 3 to 6 year olds? Do either one of you want to jump in? Matt, do you want to jump on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think these type of fairy tales and stories clearly serve as a tool to teach lessons to children. The concern is, as Kristi pointed out, are we doing them a disservice? Is this going to affect them further down the road? Basically, is this going to get kind of hinder them in their problem solving or whatever skills? You know, it's like, so yeah, they do play a big part. Fairy tales do play a big part, and they do have a beneficial, the factor to them. But I don't know. I've never had kids, so I'm kind of worried. You know, it kind of worries me. I don't want to hinder them in any way. But I wonder, so there's the clear fairy tale where the person has magical abilities and whatnot, and you touched on George Washington. I think, was it Rosa Parks as well, or something like that. Whereas George Washington, fantastical stories have been created about him that aren't necessarily true, but they're less fantastical, like the cherry tree thing, I believe. So there's that dynamic too. There's they could be a real person, but there's fantastical things attributed to them that are easier to swallow than maybe he flew or something like that, you know. So is that also as bad, or no, or I don't know. I just wanted to bring that up.
Okay, well, please, and do call me Kristi, and especially on this, I tend to only sort of bring out the Dr. Winters if I'm talking about something I've published or researched or done, so Kristi is fine in this case because I'm kind of also just being a casual social scientist on this article. I think that when it comes to the issue of child cognitive development, which is what this study sort of is located within in terms of a research area, cognitive psychologists are very interested in how we become the people we become. And there's a lot of interesting studies being done, even at the infant level, infant cognitive psychology. And they try to, well, the way that they evaluate baby reaction a lot of times is just how often baby is as young as a few months old will stare at something, and how long they stare at something is a measure of their surprise. So this is how they start to test things like object permanence. When we're born as children, we just have all the sensory, stuff coming in, but no way to categorize it, and the brain builds up those structures. So even the idea that when you put something down and then you play peekaboo, the fact that you're still behind your hands, there is a theory that says that kids perceive that you actually disappear because they can't see you, and then they have to learn object permanence. So learning to distinguish between reality and fantasy is obviously a really important part. Well, if you want to live a life that isn't based on superstition, if you want to, cast dice to try to make it rain and think it's going to work, you're going to probably be less successful than if you learn to read weather patterns. So understanding where these changes take place in terms of our brain's development is important. And so the one way to look at this is we can see the influence perhaps on kids' ability to do that when we have secular kids with a secular background, that kids can understand that a story is magical and fantastical and have that kind of childhood Disney, Pixar, ideas without mistaking it for reality and still be kids. So I think that there's something interesting going on here from sort of an atheist point of view, but also from a development of the brain and how children understand the world. So I'll wrap it up with that last comment.
All right, thank you. And I think what you're talking about perfectly ties into part of this article when one of the studies that they did focused on children between the ages of 3 and 9, and they performed 3 varying experiments as part of the study. One was called the magic box experiment, where in a room they put a box on a table and they told the children, in this case I think it was more specifically the ages 5 and 6, although they did include children from 7, 8, and 9 ages. But they put a magic box in the center of the table, and they told the children, if you put a photo inside of the magic box and close it, when you reopen it, there will be a real object. And when they left the room, they observed through the glass. They noticed that as soon as they left, that the children were attempting to perform the actual experiment themselves, that they actually went through the motion to try to make the photo a real object. And it wasn't just that. They were actually disappointed in their failure to properly conduct the exercise. The next one that they covered was the time potion, where they gave children like a bottle of water per se, or a bottle of liquid, and they said that if they were to drink it, then that it would send them back in time. And many of the children that they discussed in the article were very concerned about being displaced or getting even younger than they already were. Being a child, you want to be a big kid, so to speak, and you're very proud of the accomplishments you've done so far. So they were very apprehensive about even drinking it, even upon provocation, because they were concerned about losing a lot of that cognitive ability they gained. And then the third one was the Princess Alice experiment, where they told children that there was an invisible person in the room named Princess Alice, and in this experiment they would try to guess the name, or they would try to guess a name of someone they did not know, and Princess Alice were to help them guess this name. And they would even, older children, such as the ages of 8 and 9, would attribute things in the room, any type of motion or lights flickering on and off, as Princess Alice actually giving them a signal that they were choosing the wrong name. So under the guidance of adults, giving that these are actually plausible scenarios and that these are real things, these children between the ages of 3 and 9, whether they were secular or whether they were religious, came from those backgrounds, rather, secular backgrounds or religious backgrounds, both instances, under the guise of an adult's opinion in that respectful and respected position, they attribute a lot more reality to those fantastical stories that they assumed were normally impossible, but in this guise they attributed more reality to them. Matt, you had something?
Yeah, I just want to bring up the obvious thing at this point is, like, kids are a lump of clay. They are malleable, they're moldable, and it's up to us as adults to give them the tools to navigate the world. And when you're messing with them, you're just like, you're doing them a disservice. Like, I don't know, like it happened to me as a kid. I don't know how much it happened to you guys, but I was obviously taught religion, but I was taught like crazy woo stuff. Like like as a child, I was into tarot cards, and Kristi mentioned throwing dice. I did that. Or doing like dice reading and stuff like that. I did that as a kid, and I literally thought it was real. And it was up to myself. No parent ever told me to question it or taught me how to test it to see if it was real. It was up to me to figure that out on my own. And when that's never even laid on the table for you, like that things could be false. I mean, I think that's the least we can do as an adult or a parent the very least we can do is to teach a child that this might be wrong or this could be wrong, and nobody does that. Well, sorry, people do that, but I don't think people do it enough. So, do you have anything, Kristi?
Oh yeah. If it makes you feel any better, I sort of continued into a sort of magical thinking probably until my early 30s, and at that point I'd moved away from like monotheism and Catholicism and into Buddhism. But eventually I just kind of got to the point where I went, what if it's all in my head? What if I'm just making all this stuff up? And then there's at least for me, I felt incredibly humiliated and embarrassed and also angry that all these people, I felt like conned, So yes, there's, I think that, is it Jesuits? There's a Christian order that says, give me the child until he's 7 and I will give you the man. This idea that if you can just drill stuff into their heads when they're too young to really question it, it becomes such a permanent part of their subconscious that they'll never be able to escape it. And if there's a lot of trauma that goes along with trying to repair that child that might have been terrorized by religion as a child. So yeah, I think magical thinking, it's a huge problem, and it's how I think you end up with people who deny that climate change is a real thing, and Ben Carson thinking that the pyramids were built for grain silos, and people say ridiculous things because they think it makes sense because it came out of a book that was written in the Bronze Age when people were still living in tents and mud buildings. So yeah, I think it's actually a really important conversation to have in terms of what quality of rational thinking do we owe our kids. So I'll kick it over to somebody else then.
Yeah, you basically hit the nail on the head there. Like, what the question is, what if I'm wrong? What if it's all in my head? Nobody ever wants to ask that question. It's the simplest question. Why wouldn't we ask that question all day, every day? It's not, it's like on no one's radar. And if we, I am fine. I would be perfectly fine if everybody wanted to indoctrinate their children, as long as they taught them that one question, to keep asking that question. And I believe there are religious people who do that, in all fairness. I guess I'm patting him on the back for at least doing that. So I just want to emphasize that, is that just ask that question and teach children to question things like that.
Yeah, and I agree. This is kind of the other side of Pascal's wager. Like, we know Pascal's wager as it sits, but that's the other side of that coin. What if you're wrong? Well, what if I'm wrong? How about what if you're wrong? Out of the thousands of gods that we've had in the history of the world, in a history of the human species, even just as finite of amount of time, and as small as our existence has been, the thousands of gods that we've had, what are you wrong? You're praying to the wrong god. You're going to make the other gods angry. So absolutely, the other side of that Pascal's wager, what if they're wrong? But I think that comes back to their that aspect of critical thinking, because it's so easy to digest information that's given to you as fact, even as an adult. And we're talking about certainly 5 and 6 year olds. But as an adult, we have the same thing. It's easier to have an answer given to you and accept that answer than it is to go out and question everything and to look and research for your own well-being and for your own knowledge. In the age of information, life has gotten a lot faster, and I think a lot of people are just defaulting to information that's presented to them rather than taking the time to research and move forward. And I think that that kind of even just very shallow research is even being pushed back onto the academics, our academics, to do that. And the shallow end of the research spectrum should be all of us to create our hypothesis and then to evaluate that, and then those in the academic fields, their prospective academic fields, should be left to do that deeper thinking, engaging experiments and move forward with that. But yeah, I think you're 100% right. What do you think about that, Kristi?
Well, I was actually wanting to kind of pick up on one other point, which then you were saying something, and so my mind was sort of following what you were saying. I think it had to do with the idea of authority combined with the position that doubt is a sin. And that doubt, and one of the other things I've done on my channel, although I've been really busy with other stuff, but I was looking into people's deconversion stories and the patterns that they would go through. And one of the big problems was that a lot of times when people would have doubts in their stories, Christians was my main focus, they would talk about how it made them feel bad, that they were a failure and that it was their fault so they would internalize that guilt. And I think that this is why those early years are so important. If you have people in authority, and they're usually in the sort of, let's say, more conservative Christian belt, they're going to be men standing out behind a pulpit, promising both heaven and threatening hell. And children don't have, the kind of fear you have as a child. I used to, in my room at night, we lived out in the middle of nowhere, so the only thing I had for streetlights was occasionally somebody would drive by the country road. And I would work myself up into a panic some nights that Darth Vader was standing in the corner of my bedroom. And so those kind of irrational fears, those terrors that you have as a child, you associate those with hell. I think that that's a really powerful psychological drive that exists in a lot of adults, and that desire not to question, or even being afraid of somebody else questioning, comes from that association of risking going to hell by even thinking the wrong things. So that's what I wanted to kind of throw into the conversation as it relates to the study, and why. Well, then we can talk also about the fact that we don't teach critical thinking in schools. We don't teach reasoning, and maybe math is meant to represent it, but we actually don't teach kids ways of thinking about things critically, usually I think until you get to the teen years or maybe even university, if you go. So I'll throw that out for you guys to talk about.
So as far as doubt goes, and sorry, your mic's open, Kristi. As far as doubt goes, you're absolutely right. Religions do not want that. Well, okay, let's use Christianity. Christianity does not want doubt. There's a whole story of doubting Thomas. Like, that guy sounds like an awesome guy. Like, what's wrong with wanting to have proof? And then the story of Job, like, who didn't doubt and just still, I don't know, they tested him and he still loved God. There's so many stories to show don't doubt, and that's why I said, like, I don't know, I just wish, in that regard, I wish, like, okay, I'm kind of going back a little bit. So if you can teach a child something simple at a younger age, it kind of carries them through further. So that's why I wanted to use that question, is, ask the question, is this real? And at least teach that to your kid at a young age, because they're going to keep asking that question, and it's going to have an accumulating effect throughout their life, and it's going to kind of branch out. But I want that kind of goes into the doubt thing. It's like, you're doing them a real disservice with teaching them not to doubt. Anyways, you mentioned being a scared kid and scared of hell, and you mentioned, what was that, scared in your room? Sorry. But yeah, I totally had a flashback of being a kid. I was exposed to the movie Fire in the Sky. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but imagine it's this alien abduction movie, and it is just horrible. If you ever show that to a child, you will significantly scar them for life. But anyway, so I had a window right next to my bed, and behind the window we had the small, like, cornfield, because you mentioned being in the middle of nowhere, so I totally had a flashback to this event. And every night I would lay in my bed shivering, like, absolutely certain that there was an alien standing in the window just waiting for me to fall asleep. And so when I made it to the morning time, I would go out and search the field and look for any sign of an alien craft that landed. So I kind of had that, you know what I mean, like, let's see if we can test this kind of thing as a kid, and it helped me get through it. And I didn't know at the time what I was doing, but I was like, there should be evidence here. The corn should be rustled, or maybe there's alien footprints. But I was way too scared at the time to actually look out the window. I was just certain that they were out there. So I don't know. I just wanted to bring that up. Go ahead, B.A.
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of address 2 points. One was from Matt and one was from Kristi. So Matt, earlier you said that kids are like clay. They're very easily moldable. And that kind of ties into what Kristi was saying about sociocultural and psycho-emotional effects of indoctrination, and what that means not only for the children but also for the for adults when they become adults, and how that will affect not only their attitudes and their behaviors, their ability to properly emotionally react to situations. Because let's face it, when when you're faced with extreme events and you are shown that the creator of the universe as you believe it to be will respond to any type of normal event that happened, millennia ago as an extreme reaction, and you're built in his image, and it's my opinion that you're much more likely to develop those same type of behaviors. So when presented with any type of confrontation or conflict, you're much more likely to internalize it and personalize the attack rather than being able to separate the belief from the opinion. And you will jump into that attack and you'll have a much more extreme reaction because of your upbringing and the way that you were taught how reactions are supposed to be. The next point I wanted to address was from Kristi when she mentioned that we don't teach critical thinking until much later on, and I know that here we in the United States we've moved to the Common Core system, and from what I've heard about Common Core, it's teaching critical thinking using critical shortcuts. I know someone that has a child and I know critical shortcuts is just my terminology. That's not anything academic, so please, you'll have to forgive that. But so I know someone that has a child in Common Core. They have a few children actually in public school using the Common Core system, and as far as math, literature, being able to distinguish symbols from literature and to be able to connect all of that together, the way that they're teaching, even though that is much different from how we learned, I have been told in this anecdotal evidence, of course, hearsay, right? But I've been told that these children can more quickly get to the result in the way that they've been taught how to do it. So the shortcuts that they're using are promoting critical thinking, and it's actually helping his children to understand more advanced concepts quicker because of the more fundamental shortcuts that they've had in their math, science, and literature in understanding some of those advanced concepts. I don't know if that's certainly true, but that's just what I've been presented, so I'm not sure what the actual implication of it is, if that's actually true for all children or if this is just an exception and how his children learn and work. Matt, you had something to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I wanted to touch on this. I mean, that's awesome what you're going into, but you mentioned, I want to go back earlier, you mentioned that for adults too, adults have to deal with these scenarios, but I feel like for an adult, we've had a lot more experience, we have a lot more tools to be able to bounce back from maybe making a wrong decision or being fooled by something, whereas a child, it could be a lot more devastating. It could be, and when you tie that in with you're building the palette for this child, you're building the toolbox for them for their entire life, I think we really need to focus on getting the proper tools to the children, like you said, like whether it's a shortcut or whatever it may be, that work, and what I mean, that'll create the adult, as we said earlier, give us a child till 7, what I mean, I'll make a man. So this is like a reoccurring thing, we need to really help the kids, I guess. So that's all I had.
Okay, yeah, and this conversation drives forward, and when you're talking about children and indoctrination, and you're also talking about how adults are operating in our society and internationally, there was a forum conducted by Pew Research Institute, where the Pew Forum on Religion in 2008 conducted this forum, and it stated about 84% of the families that were obviously addressed in the United States reported a religious affiliation. Under that same Pew Forum, about 16% of families do not go to church. So thereby, most children are presented with seemingly impossible events brought out by divine intervention. Now, the 16% children regard the religious stories as fairy tales and implausible due to implausible outcomes, but when we're talking about this indoctrination, I mean, and you talk about setting kids up for success, just from that information from Pew and just looking at the numbers as they sit in the United States, that means that we're setting up for failure a lot more children. And this isn't, I know that I'm making a sweeping generalization, and I apologize for that, but based on the statistics I've been presented and what we've talked about so far, it just seems like you're setting up more adults to be able to react extremely and to not be able to properly assess the situation and the reality and the gravity of their situation when they're put in any slightly more extreme than normal event. Kristi, do you want to kind of chime in on that?
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, you're making a really good point, and I'll just be the sort of cautious social scientist because this is in our nature, which is to say, this is one study. Actually, it's two studies, so it's one article. But, I mean, the theories that they're working with are not invalid or crazy or anything, and this, again, seems to fit within the kind of other findings that have been located about children's ability to distinguish imaginary from real. And what is interesting from the study is that exposure to people of authority who are making fantastical claims, shall we just call them just generally, and also exposure to religion, just those things do seem to have an effect. So yes, I think that we should be, I don't want to say concerned, but I think we should be very aware of the role that early childhood indoctrination plays. And I think the evidence for that indoctrination, you can compare rates of belief on very basic facts from the United States and Europe. Europeans do not think that God, are much less likely to think that human evolution was directed by God. But Americans, disproportionately think that if God didn't create humans directly, that he guided evolution. And I think that is really, you can trace that back. I can't prove it, of course, but I think it's intuitively plausible to think that starts in childhood indoctrination. So as the U.S. seems to now be catching up, almost in some ways kind of rapidly with Europe, the rates of secularization and the decline in religious rates as a consequence of many factors, including the internet in the last 15, 20 years in the U.S., the U.S. does seem to be catching up. So I would expect that in a few generations, or not in a few generations, but in 20 years, as these children now growing up in secular homes reach maturity and start answering surveys, we're going to see those rates of belief decline as their cohort ages. But it's going to take some time. So yeah, I do think it's worth being concerned about, because because we tend to say, oh, in the schools, but what this study points to is that it's not the schools that are doing this, it's inside the home and in the churches. And then we say, well, we hope people are rational, but then you look at the Creationist Museum. So yeah, I think that it's a very potentially explosive but important topic to unpack, even beyond the study, just in terms of the implications and what we see in terms of the differences of Europe and the US. So I'll kick it back to one of you guys then.
Real quick, I just want to say, you mentioned that the U.S. seems to be catching up with Europe. We'll see in this next election. If we get Bernie Sanders in, then I might agree with you. But if we get a Republican in, then I have no hope. And I might be moving over there and visiting you sometime. Anyways, I wanted to just throw this out there. We don't have to go down that road. BA has something, but I want to say, is there any interest in looking at the Christian side of things, kind of a devil advocate kind of view? Like, they think they are seeing the truth. They think they are teaching their children the truth. But there is a way we can test this and look at it, and this paper is a perfect example that we can see the effects on our children and look at it objectively and actually find out what works better and what, whether we can prove whether religion is real or God exists or not. We could still look at this. We can look at how we're affecting our children. So maybe we could go down that. But what do you got, BA?
Well, I'll address your question first, and then I had 2 points that you guys have brought up. So looking at it from I think it is advantageous whenever you're trying to talk about any type of critical situation or how you're going to approach any type of situation, psychological, emotional, social, spiritual, in many cases, depending on your definition. I think it's advantageous to look at every side, because you absolutely, looking at it from different perspectives, whether or not you agree with that perspective can kind of help set you in the right mind frame of equality, not necessarily equality for all, but it'll give you, when you jump into that perspective and you think of it from that point of view. I know that Christians have this very, in the United States at least, have this victim complex, but sometimes looking at it from the other person's point of view can kind of give you a little bit of insight into how they're thinking, so not only you can approach the situation from your own point of view, but when you're engaging other people, especially in those situations, you'll have a better understanding of how to work with other people. And then the other point that Kristi made that I wanted to bring up real quick before I pass it over to Matt, was like European, and I'm very glad that you brought up, European culture as well, since, Matt and I existing in the United States, so we have more experience with that. It's nice to get that European point of view. But European versus U.S. opinion on like young Earth, creationism, evolution, where the European consensus is, much more, I'm going to use the word factual, when it comes to those things, and the United States is not. But if you look at the Department of Labor statistics on the amount of hours that we put in per person in the United States, being the most industrialized, being the nation that puts in the most time per week per person, could that be, we have less time, so we're more likely, and some of those people that are more gullible and more likely to just accept information, it almost seems like that gives them a little bit more of a way out, being more industrialized of a nation, that maybe we'll just accept it better. And then the last thing, so the WIU, the Western Illinois University, every election, I just want to touch on this very briefly, and this kind of actually is a current event, I guess, but our Western Illinois University, every election goes through and they take all the candidates and they use a very advanced process of selecting not only the DNC and the Republican, the Democratic and the Republican tickets, but they also look at who wins the election. They've accurately predicted every election that they've actually done the study on, and they predicted that the Bernie O'Malley ticket, that Bernie won, O'Malley won O'Malley got the vice, and the Bernie O'Malley ticket won by a ratio of 48% versus 39% over the Bush-Rubio ticket. And as far as Electoral College, the Bernie O'Malley ticket got 411 of the Electoral College votes. I just thought I'd throw that out there. I just read it the other day. So, yeah, I'm going to pass it back over to Matt.
Okay, what I'm about to say might not make any sense, and I'm apologizing ahead of time. I haven't really formed it in my head yet, but this is going back a little bit to what we're talking about, the devil's advocate thing, and looking at their point of view. I realized that that's like this kind of meta, kind of inception level thing, that if we look at their point of view, going into it with our tool set we have now, we are basically looking at a fantasy story and doing what a child should be doing. I don't know, like we are the child now looking at the fantasy. I don't know, I just had this whole thing. I just wanted to bring that up. Okay, what do you have, Kristi?
Whoa, that's my inception noise. Sorry, CinemaSins, blaming CinemaSins. Right, so a couple things. One is, in terms of why America is religious, I had recently on my channel Stephen Cattell, who does religion and politics, or actually non-religious belief in politics and other secular issues at Warwick in the UK. And the United States is a really weird case because the US is more religious than any other sort of developed country in terms of our peer group, and a lot of that goes back to the way the nation was formed. We have a very big country. We have a federalist system, so we don't, in the UK, in Germany, in France. I mean, I can be in the UK on a plane in 90 minutes. That's how close another country is from me to an airport, right? Like I couldn't get out of, like Wisconsin maybe in 90 minutes. I could probably get to the Canadian border, but it's harder. So you have local communities. Those communities were even far away from their state capitals, so the churches became really important as social services. And when people were spreading out west, stealing territory from the Native Americans, they didn't have the federal government, they didn't have state support, so it was the churches that provided it. So this idea of religiosity sustaining communities is uniquely American, and it's a holdover that we've had for a very long time. Whereas in Europe, where they had the First World War and that sort of crisis that led to modernism and all the dark sort of art that came out of it, and they had Nietzsche and other people who questioned God's existence, and then the Second World War obviously was another huge moral crisis for Europeans. So and it happened here. I live in Cologne, and I walk down streets where there are little brass plaques in the cobblestone, and they have these as an art installation across Europe. And on the little black brass plaque is the name of a Holocaust victim who lived at that address. And sometimes it's one person, and they have the name of their birth, and if they know at their death and what day they were taken, if they know what camp they went to, and if they survived the camp or if they died at the camp. And sometimes it's a whole row because it's a family. So I walk over those ghosts, every day. And America, while 9/11 was a horrible attack, it happened in one city, and it didn't have a kind of devastation. So the religious crises of Europe didn't really happen in the United States. So our secularization process seems to be generational. It has to do with young people who have the education and access to the internet, who can go out and question things and realize that there are questions, they're being exposed to ideas that I wasn't exposed to because I didn't have the internet, for a long time. So religiosity in the US is very different. And from a positive point of view, I'll just say this and then I'll wrap up and kick it over to whomever wants to go. I lived in the UK, and there are no more sort of laid-back, not-in-your-face people than Church of England Christians. They're barely religious. I had a friend who they had their child baptized, and neither of them were particularly religious, sort of more culturally Christian. And even that, at that service, the vicar said, "Do you reject Satan and all his works?" And then sort of said, "We don't actually believe in like a personal Satan. That just means really bad things." So, we wouldn't see that at a fundamentalist Baptist church. It's really hard to be offended at people like that. So I think in terms of defending it, maybe people from, let's say, a C of E point of view, Christian would say, life is harsh in a lot of ways. Bad things happen. Fairy tales can sometimes teach kids in a way that's not so scary that they shouldn't go with strangers. Hansel and Gretel is a terrifying story, but it teaches you to be wary of people offering you candy. Death is terrible, and it's a very hard thing for kids to get their head around. So maybe telling them that their grandmother is living somewhere else makes it a little bit easier until they get older. So I think that there are ways to defend it, but my sort of charitable view would really only extend to people who are quite on the liberal side of things, rather than the fundamentalists who say, well, biblical gender roles and, husbands take all the money and women stay home and clean, and that's how God wants it, so that's how you have to live your life. I would obviously not support that or try to justify that in any way. So, all right, I'm done.
Okay, that was great. So this is getting a little off topic. I apologize. I think it's on topic, but it's getting a little off. You mentioned the role of churches in the formation of America, and I always kind of had this feeling that, yeah, church and religion had its day, it had its purpose, it had its usefulness in helping people and, maybe even controlling people in times where we didn't have any other thing to fill that void. And I talked to a friend of mine about this. He's into economy and stuff like that, politics. But anyways, I have this problem right now with the American basically class system. I mean, it's like, when are we going to outgrow this? And it's more of a, oh, all right, hold on. So it's an American thing. It's a whole all right, I'm going to lose my train of thought. It's a whole capitalist thing, whereas in Europe it's a more socialist and you know what I'm saying, more for the people. But what I feel like is, the capitalist thing, it was fine for a time, and it's kind of, we're moving away from that, and it's kind of this whole big thing where the European system and whatever area is a lot older than ours, and they've already evolved past these things quicker than us because they've been through these type of things, and we're at this point now where we're still clinging to capitalism, and hopefully someday it'll move on, just like religion seems to be doing. So it's just kind of like, I don't know what to call it, but if you want to touch on that, you can. I'm messing this up, so.
No, I think what we're doing as a nation is we're growing up. We're getting more mature, and you're correct, Kristi. I agree with you that in the church had a very important social service, relayed information. We talked about news and current events during a time when there wasn't instant access to everything that's going on in the world. For many people, going to church was actually hearing what was going on everywhere else. It gave you that connection, whereas a church was a focal point in a community where you had all your farmers, your ranchers, your store owners. It was more towards the center of town, where the entire community could get together and exchange ideas, goods, and other services, and kind of meet that that social need, whereas they were much more isolated. And we still have a lot of that isolation in different parts of the United States, as well as the different parts internationally. But I did kind of want to ask you a question, Kristi. I want to bring it back to my question before, which I just got it just got lost because I went on a diatribe. But my question was, do you think it's much easier in the United States as well, not just because of our religious history, but do you think the religiosity of the United States is more easily digestible because the amount of time that we put in as a nation into work, and the shorter breaks, the less breaks, the more hours? Do you think it's easier for us to to be religious because we're hopeful that we won't have to do that anymore, and also because it's easier to digest those answers rather than to think on my own? Kristi?
So I think, in a way, yes, but I don't think it's an employment issue. Well, it is an employment issue, and it does kind of come back to class. So in Europe, people don't fundamentally, as an ideological position, say the government can't help people in their daily life. That's why we have, well, also distance. We have great public transportation, and German transportation is fantastic. There's a better social safety net. Right, so the state catches you, whereas in the United States, because conservatives want to put a stranglehold on the government, they want to cut off social services funded by taxpayer dollars. They want to cut off, kids' education. That makes people dependent on the church. They have to rely on charity from a religious institution, and that's why conservatives continually say that it's not the job of, it should be the role of charities to do charity, not the role of government. But it's precisely that dependence on other people's charity that allows people, that I think kind of sucks them in or keeps them going. And also just the fact that, until very recently, and still too many Americans go without health care. And when you don't have health care, all you have is prayer. And there's the lack of job security. There's a lot more anxiety about those kinds of things because of the way that wealth is distributed in the United States as compared to with Europe. So I think that because of more emotional, economic, and the sort of health instabilities, the people, especially the most vulnerable, are more likely to then rely on religious institutions or religious faith to help them through, because the state is being deliberately made to fail in its duty to its citizens, in my opinion, having lived in a country where they don't have that view of government.
What we're talking about right now, I hope there's no, well, a good thing that there are no, that I know of, conservatives that watch our videos. But if they did, they just would have gotten another bullet for their gun for their fear-mongering. Socialism kills religion. Oh no! When people are more adequately supported by their peers, they're less likely to trust in an ethereal sky daddy. That's very dangerous. So I hope that I hope that those audio points, that those snippets don't get leaked to Mark Rubio or Jeb Bush, because then Bernie will have more problems on our hands because of us. All right. So Matt, Kristi for president 2016. Well, I want Bernie to win. I'm sorry, Kristi, but maybe Kristi for president 2024. I don't know. Maybe we'll push it forward a little bit, because we need Bernie right now. But no,
he could be vice president. I'd take either of them. All right, sorry.
Okay, so Dr. Kristi Winters for President 2016, Vice President Bernie Sanders, Speaker of the House Mark O'Malley. Well, we can do
there
that.
You go. We get a woman in, and we get Bernie. It's a double threat, dude.
Yeah, double threat. Matt, did you want to address what Kristi said?
I mean, it's just awesome. I completely agree. I don't know what else to say. I mean, that's why I'm voting for her this year, or whatever, next year.
All right. Well, so I think if we're okay with it, unless you guys have any other talking points you'd like to do, we can move on to the weekly absurdity. Is that cool? Okay, so we do this section in our show where we read from the Skeptic's Annotated Bible something pertaining to the theme. We bring up a scripture or just a verse or a few verses that tie together, and then Matt will read it, and then we'll kind of talk about it. We'll giggle a little bit, maybe tell some anecdotes, and move forward with it. Matt, are you ready to read our weekly absurdity?
Yes, I am. Okay, if you're following along at home, we are on skepticsannotatedbible.com on the absurdities section, and I looked for one that pertained to children for this episode. It's number 163. And in summary, God wants to be remembered forever for the mass murder of little children. And if you click on the little link there, it brings you to Exodus 10, and I'm going to read 10:1 and 10:2 for context, so I'm not taking it out of context, so nobody can say that. And it's, I'll give my own summary really quick. It's basically God is telling, I don't know, whatever, his followers to tell their children about how he basically had a mass genocide in Egypt and all the plagues in Egypt, so their children can grow up and fear God and know how powerful and what a dick God is, basically. So 10:1, and the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants, that I might shew these my signs before him. 10:2, and that thou mayest tell in the ears of thy son and of thy son's son what things I have wrought in Egypt, and my signs which I have done among them, and ye may know how that I am the Lord. So, yeah, he's pretty proud of the things he's done, and he wants you, your kids, and your kids' kids, and everybody to know about his genocide and how awesome he is. And that's a good thing to teach your children. So, what, you guys have any feelings on that?
Actually, I do. It ties perfectly. I'm glad that you picked that one because it ties perfectly into our indoctrination. And it's stories like that, the fantasy, it ties into the is this just a fantasy? You know, when hearing a story, any type of story, you know, between either, you know, fairy tale or any story, just in general, fiction or nonfiction, children use the plot points of that story to determine whether the protagonists are good or bad or just real in general, like we talked about earlier. And given the circumstances, when you're talking about this indoctrination, I don't think you should just believe anything you're told just because you're told it. I think that that's pretty obvious that, you know, we're probably at some type of consensus on that. But I mean, just being told something without questioning it, it's not just a gullibility, that's a willful ignorance. And for children where they don't have that willful ignorance, they're being told by an authority figure, a person of authority in their life, you know, what this is and that this is real, and then they digest that and they include that not only into their worldview but into their concept of reality, that it just completely it warps children's availability to not only develop a healthy imagination, in my opinion, but also to be able to adequately discern realistic outcomes for events that are happening in real life. So, Kristi, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Only that the Bible, in some ways, I feel like it's one of the most abused books that exists, because in some ways, if you just came across it without human civilization, you know, like 10,000 years, and you just came across these stories and you were able to triangulate it to this tribe that lived in a remote, you know, area of the world and had these fantastical stories, it would tell you something really profound about the mentality of the people living at that time, their worldview, how they understand their own, like that literally God is above them in the sky, and people are, like hell or the death place of the dead is literally under your feet, and this is the whole universe, and you'd be able to build up this picture of how earlier people, I don't want to say primitive because that's not really fair, but earlier people who had no education, no information at all, tried to explain their worldview. And instead what it ends up being used as is this authoritative book with a character who's been invented by multiple authors that basically is backed up by fear and social discipline and has some moral points in there, but a lot of it is just not appropriate anymore. And that we're still telling kids these stories. Maybe part of the reason there's a disconnect these days is because kids increasingly don't understand what a shepherd is and what a flock is, and you know what a manger is, and it must to these kids who grow up with iPhones and iPads to think about a guy walking around the desert with talking about fig trees and mustard seeds. He just must sound so completely out of connection with their lives. So I wonder how much, in some ways, kids will increasingly be alienated from religion by technology, just because, in all honesty, it's another step away from us, you know, living in mud buildings that makes us less connect emotionally with those tales and those characters.
That's awesome. I want to expand on that. So from my perspective, I mean, I thought about the same thing, but from my perspective, it's like I do stargazing a lot, and I go out with binoculars. I lay in my backyard, and maybe I had a few drinks or whatever on the weekend, so it's like, whoa, look at that. It's just amazing. So I lay out there, and I think, and in my scenario, and now I'm not a conspiracy theorist guy. I don't think we've encountered aliens yet, but I imagine an alien coming across our civilization and seeing what kind of crazy crap we got going on here, and finding this book, like you said, you know what I mean, maybe 1,000 years from now, somebody finds the book, and they don't, they're not in the same context as we are. So I imagine as an alien coming to this planet and seeing all these things, and I obviously think of them finding the Bible. They must think that we're still clinging to this, and people still believe this. How backwards they must think we would be, And not only that, but the way our society is structured. Like, I just lay there, like, in awe of the universe, and then it helps me look from the outside in as well. And it's just, I don't know, just try to, I think people should try to do that sometimes. Just put yourself outside of your situation and pretend you don't know anything about this planet, you don't know anything about religion, you don't know anything about our social systems, and look at it from the outside and just look at how crazy everything is. It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm an alien here on this planet. I mean, I'm getting kind of deep, or not deep, but whatever, blowing my own mind here, but you know what I'm saying? It's like, all right, what do you got, BA?
All right, I like that. So I think that if any type of extraterrestrial life had observed our planet, they would have said, let's come back in about 100,000 of their years and let's see what they're doing. Maybe they'll actually be intelligent by that point.
That's part of that's. I definitely thought that too. It's like they could have already came and they're like, all right, keep going. It's like I wouldn't stop here. Who would stop here?
Yeah, I don't think anyone that didn't want to kill us would stop here. Let's put it that way. We have nothing of value to offer anyone but ourselves at this current moment, and that's just self-development. So, Kristi, I wanted to just go back to one of your points where you said that the Bible is the most beat-up book for a few reasons, and I'm sure it might be a lot different in Europe, where it's a little bit less, I don't know, I want to say geographically separated as far as being multicultural. Like there's even in the United States, there are many of the large cities, everyone is pressed into each other. That causes those conversations and causes those questions and that intelligent discussion. But I would say the majority of the United States is more probably separated by ideology, and then the people will, birds of a feather stick together, so to speak. So those people tend to they'll gravitate towards each other to have a similar opinion rather than a conversation about why their opinions are different. It's much easier to talk to people you have stuff in common with than it is to have a conversation with someone you don't agree with and to try to bring it forward. So we do beat up the Bible, especially on this show. Every single week we beat it up a little bit, but I think that's because in the United States, that is the most prolific. Going back to that Pew Forum where it stated 84% of the individuals that were conducted in that survey identified as being religious, and I would say the majority of those were probably some denomination of Christianity. So given the fact that that is the most quoted, cited, referenced book to promote oppression and hatred in the United States, us living in the United States, we're certainly going to beat up on it more. But I think that's why more people beat up on Christianity and the Bible, and they also beat up more on Islam and Muslims, because those are the two not only just in-your-face religions and in-your-face books, but they're also the largest. Some of the largest groups in the world. Islam, excuse me, I'll correct myself. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, and atheism or secular humanism or being secular, whatever you want to call it that day, is the largest growing group in the world statistically. You go to FBI website looking at demographics of society, even internationally, and they state those statistics. They have those statistics on their website. So do you, Matt or Kristi, do you two have anything you want to say before we move on to our final segment?
Yeah, real quick, could you just share that picture? Because you basically just described this picture basically describes Christianity in our.
All right, hold on. Let me screen share that real quick.
It was in regards to what you were describing Christianity in our country.
Okay, so for those, it is a little small, but for those of you that might not be able to read it, it says, "Knock, knock. Who's there? It's Jesus. Let me in. Why? I have to save you. From what? What I'm going to do to you if you don't let me in."
That sums up the entirety of Christianity in our country, pretty much. For me.
It really does. That fear-mongering, just hate-based, politically charged speak that we use in this country. It's almost like Stockholm Syndrome, really, because the people that are being oppressed by the individuals identify with their ideology and are willing to vote for them, even though the middle class tends to be more conservative in the United States. They're being beaten down by the conservative side of the country as far as legislation goes. So definitely Stockholm Syndrome there. Kristi, did you want to add anything to either the glorious meme that Matt shared or to the couple of points I've talked about so far?
Yeah, if I might. In terms of, I think Christianity in the United States and politics is very complicated. And, we shouldn't discount, we talked about saying both sides. There is a Christian left. And there are people who are working towards things like marriage equality and working on helping refugees and other things. So I know that in the spirit of the show, we don't want to paint with a broad brush. But there is certainly a kind of union of political power and religion in the U.S. that I don't see existing in Europe, even in a formal structure like the House of Lords, where you have members of the Church of England sort of in an unelected body that can't really do anything legislatively. It kind of has an opinion. But because of the role of faith in people's personal lives, they bring those values with them when they go for political office. And since the foundation of shortly after, let's say, the establishment of the United States as a federal, 1789, when the Constitution went into effect. In many ways, the Enlightenment happened in Europe in terms of the ideas of, basically science and reason, deism, moving away from faith into deism and looking more at the natural world, and the idea of human rights, and at least the rights of men, as they were termed at that time. And all those ideas emerged in Europe, but they really came to fruition. They were really born in the Constitution. The Constitution is an enlightenment. It's a European document. The Constitution is the culmination of all of the values of the Enlightenment: the separation of church and state, the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, the requirements of a probable cause and a warrant. All of these things are a direct result of European philosophy. So we have this European document, but then the United States is sort of like, has covered it up with religion almost everywhere it can. And for most of the time that we've been a country, nobody's objected to that until, sort of the 1960s, and people started to really take these cases to court. Which I've covered a little bit in my Get Smarter series, the one Vakashi and McCullen, and there was a McCullen versus a school board, which separated the gut prayer out of schools, along with Madeline Murray O'Hare, two great women who stood up for secularism in the United States. So I think it's the combination of faith and political power, and in particular faiths. And I'm not just raising Christianity here, but any faiths that seeks to impose itself on non-believers is very, very troubling and troublesome, in my opinion.
Kill the infidels! Yeah, so that's exactly what you're talking about, imposing that faith on others. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe I just heard you reference the religious patriarchy, which is one series on your channel that I enjoy watching, and I try to leave comments whenever I see it, and I try to argue with those assholes on there that want to say hateful things. I'm glad to see that most of their comments, at least the ones that are just detrimental, just fucking horrible. Sorry, there's no other words for it. It's fucking horrible and disgusting, So I'm glad to see that many of those get removed. All right, Matt said, "Hold on, man, hold on." All right. So, But I agree with what you said, and I'm glad that you brought that up. So now we are going to move on to our final segment, which is our Atheist Spotlight. Which on the right-hand side of the Heretic Clerics YouTube channel, there is a section identified as Atheist Spotlight. Every week we highlight one individual on there, and then they go up to the top of the list, and they sit at the top of the list for the next week, so that you can check out their stuff. We sub them, pimp out their content a little bit. But I would like to shift it over to Dr. Winters. She has someone that she'd like to highlight to talk about why they're awesome, what they do, what social medias they're on, and why she likes them and why they're awesome. So, Kristi?
Yeah, thanks. I want to do a plug for my friend and fellow YouTuber Tony Reed, and he has a series that's called How Creationism Taught Me Real Science. Now, before anyone goes, what creationism can't teach me science, I would say that you should certainly give it a try, because he really is directing it toward people who are creationists to kind of expose the problems with creationist arguments. And he does a really great video. He does amazing amounts of research. So from an Amazon, Amazon shopping experience, if you like, say, like the Bible skeptic, but imagine that's sort of more of science, or if you enjoyed Potholer 54's stuff on creationism or on science, or if you maybe at one point enjoyed why people laugh at creationists. Well, this is sort of like the 21st century. This is like the 20-teens version of that video series. It's really up to date. It's fantastic. Tony's got a great voice. He does great images and animation kind of things in his videos as well. They're usually less than 12 minutes. I think he tries to keep them to 10. And if you really like his videos, then on the far right side of the screen on the top hand, I did an interview with him as well, so you can see the man behind the videos. But his series is really fantastic. I not only urge you to try out his videos, but sub him as well, because his content is phenomenal. And that will be it for my plug.
All right, well, I have subbed him. I'm looking forward to, I have never seen him before. I've never even heard of Tony Reed, so I'm looking forward to checking out his content for sure. He will also be highlighted on the right-hand side of the Heretic Clerics YouTube channel, so please, when you go over to our channel, however you've seen this video, if you're not already sub us, and then sub him. You'll see him on the right-hand side, and then obviously, sub Kristi Winters as well. So today we talked about a very deep topic. We digressed a little bit, but it was all relative, I think. So, Matt, did you have something before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I just want to get this. Oh boy. I don't know if I can do it. Is that really loud?
Just talk a little bit louder, or type it in the chat and I can read it while I'm doing my conclusion if you want.
I just want to say I'm going to tell my kids about this fictional character I met, Kristi, and they're not going to believe me, so it's going to be hard because she's so amazing and mythical.
Yes, we definitely had a mythical magical show this time, magical mythical show, very fantastical in nature. So, all right, we talked about the cognitive science just today I'm having a hard time. We talked about the article in the Cognitive Science Multidisciplinary Journal. We brought it back about, is this just fantasy? And we talked about the studies that they did inherently, some of the statistics that they had in that study, as well as some of the experiments in those studies. And I kind of want to leave it with, we're left with this question from this, and from this whole discussion. When children hear about such protagonists in these fantastical stories, do they grasp that some are make-believe whereas others are real? Let us know what you think in the comment section below, or you send us an email to hereticclerics@gmail.com, and depending on the amount of responses we get, we might just have to make a follow-up video to this one. We'll include some of your comments and questions and other things. If you have any comments or questions, please send them to us as well. But I would really like to thank Dr. Kristi Winters for coming on our show. Please go check out her channel. Go check out Tony Reed. Again, going to be the Atheist Spotlight section on the right-hand side of the Heretics YouTube channel. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you had a happy Massacre Day last week in the United States. I know that today is actually, Advent Sunday in Europe. So thank you guys for stopping by. Really appreciate you guys coming around and watching this discussion that we're very thankful to have with Kristi Winters. And from all of us here, I would like to say, deuces.